Welcome to Muzi Horror World, and hello to tonight's terrifying tale. If you're ready to dive into the supernatural world, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss any of our spine-chilling stories. We have a lot more eerie tales coming your way, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single one. If you enjoyed our ghostly tales, please make sure to like this video because it helps us bring more creepy content to you. And as always, we love hearing from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. So, sit back, take a deep breath, and prepare yourself for tonight's haunting story, because what's about to happen, you won't believe. Story number 1. Have you ever woken up in a cold sweat, heart racing, only to realize the nightmare you just escaped feels like it's still lurking in the shadows of your room? Imagine this. A dream where a man with no face stares back at you. No eyes, no mouth, just an empty, smooth void. His presence is unsettling, his silence deafening, and yet, you can't look away. What if this wasn't just a dream? They say dreams are the windows to the subconscious. But what happens when something from the other side of the window starts peeking into your world? You see him once in a dream, harmless enough, right? But then you notice him again, standing across the street in broad daylight. At first, you think it's your mind playing tricks, but his blank, featureless visage is impossible to ignore. He doesn't chase you. He doesn't speak. He just stands there, watching, if you can even call it that. This is the story of the faceless man, a chilling figure who slips effortlessly between dreams and reality. Some call him a nightmare, others a curse, but those who've encountered him say one thing. Once he finds you, he never truly leaves. In this video, we'll unravel the terrifying legend of the faceless man. What is he? A figment of imagination, a supernatural entity, or something far worse? And most importantly, if you ever encounter him, whether in your dreams or while you're awake, what can you do to escape his haunting grip? Brace yourself for a journey into the unknown. By the end, you might not want to close your eyes ever again. Keep watching if you dare. Dreams have always been a gateway to the unknown, a realm where reality dissolves and the subconscious takes over. For centuries, people have shared tales of bizarre, unsettling dreams. But what if one of those dreams didn't stay confined to the night? It begins with a single dream. You're walking through a place you know, a street you've walked 100 times, a park you visited as a child. Yet, it's eerily quiet. No sounds of birds, no distant hum of life, just silence. That's when you notice him. He's standing far away, almost at the edge of your vision. At first, you can't make out his features. You might even think he's just another passerby. But as you look closer, a chill runs down your spine. He has no face. There are no eyes to meet yours, no mouth to speak, no expressions to read. Just a smooth, blank surface that somehow feels more unnerving than the most grotesque nightmare. He doesn't move. He doesn't chase you. He simply exists. You wake up, drenched in sweat, your heart pounding. It's just a dream, you tell yourself. A meaningless fragment of your subconscious. But as the day unfolds, small things begin to feel wrong. Shadows seem to stretch just a bit too far. Reflections linger longer than they should, and you can't shake the feeling that you're being watched. Then, the dreams return. Each night, the faceless man gets closer. His presence is suffocating, his silence deafening. The settings of the dreams shift: a dark forest, an abandoned house, an endless corridor. But he's always there, always watching. One night, you wake up abruptly, gasping for air. The dream is still fresh in your mind, but as you glance around the room, you freeze. The corner of your bedroom is darker than usual, the shadows deeper. That's when you see it, the faint outline of a figure. Your breath catches. You blink, and he's gone. By now, you're too scared to sleep, but exhaustion always wins. And when it does, the lines between dreams and reality blur even further. You see him not just at night, but during the day. A fleeting figure at the edge of your vision. A reflection in a store window. A shadow in the crowd. You confide in friends, but they laugh it off. Just a bad dream, they say. But how do you explain the fact that he's everywhere you go? You start searching for answers online, desperate for an explanation. That's when you stumble upon others who've seen him too. There are entire forums dedicated to him. Some call him an ancient entity, others a psychological phenomenon. A few believe he's a spirit, drawn to people in moments of vulnerability. But the stories all share one chilling similarity. Once he appears, he never leaves. One post stands out. It describes a ritual, a way to confront him, to force him to leave you alone. It sounds absurd, dangerous even, but you're willing to try anything. The ritual requires precision. A mirror, a dark room, and an offering of something personal, a photograph, a lock of hair. You follow the steps, heart pounding with every move. As you light the final candle, the air grows heavy. Shadows twist unnaturally, and the room feels alive. And then he's there. This time, he's closer than ever. His featureless face is impossible to look at, yet you can't turn away. Following the ritual's instructions, you call out to him, demanding to know who or what he is. For a moment, nothing happens. Then, his blank face begins to change. The smooth surface ripples like water, forming shapes. Eyes appear, but they're hollow and empty. A mouth forms, but it twists into a grotesque smile. "You wanted to see me," he whispers, his voice like 1,000 echoes. "Now you're part of me." Before you can react, everything goes dark. When you wake up, you're not in your room. You're standing in an endless expanse of gray, a place that feels like nowhere and everywhere. In the distance, you see people. At first, they look normal, but as they approach, you realize they're faceless. Panic sets in. You try to scream, but no sound escapes your lips. It's then you realize the horrifying truth. You've become one of them. You're the faceless figure now, trapped in the same cycle, waiting to haunt someone else's dreams. As time passes, your existence fades into the background. You become a shadow, a fleeting figure, a nightmare to someone new. And the cycle continues, unbroken, unstoppable. Story number 2. Deep within the heart of an ancient forest lies a secret, one that whispers through the rustling leaves and hides in the shadows of towering trees. For centuries, this forest has stood untouched by human hands, shrouded in mystery and fear. Locals call it cursed. They say anyone who enters never comes back the same, if they come back at all. But is it a curse? Or is it something else? Imagine wandering into these woods on a quiet evening, thinking it's just another stretch of wilderness. At first, it seems peaceful, tranquil, even, but as you go deeper, you feel it. The air grows heavier, charged with something you can't quite name. The trees seem to watch your every move, their gnarled roots twisting like frozen serpents. Then you hear it, the sound of something following you, not loud, but deliberate. And that's when you see it. A creature steps out from the shadows, unlike anything you've ever imagined. Its form is both terrifying and mesmerizing, blending seamlessly with the forest itself. Eyes like glowing embers pierce the darkness, and its presence radiates an overwhelming sense of power. You try to run, but there's no escaping it. You've crossed into its domain, and now you're at its mercy. In this video, we'll uncover the legend of the Forest Guardian, a being said to protect its woods by any means necessary. Who or what is it? Is it a benevolent protector, a vengeful spirit, or something far more ancient and primal? And most importantly, what happens when you find yourself face to face with it? Stay with me as we journey into the unknown. But be warned, some places aren't meant to be disturbed, and some creatures won't let you leave. There's something ancient about untouched forests. They stand as remnants of a time before cities, before roads, before humans carved their mark on the earth. These places hum with life, but also with something else, something that feels alive in a way you can't quite explain. The forest at the center of this story is one such place. Spanning miles of dense wilderness, it is both feared and revered. Locals call it the Sentinel Woods. For centuries, it has been the subject of whispered tales, of hunters who disappeared without a trace, of travelers who ventured in and came out changed. But the most chilling stories are about the Guardian. No one knows what it looks like. Those who claim to have seen it speak only in fragments. Glowing eyes, antlers like twisted branches, and a presence that freezes the soul. They say the forest itself bends to its will, and once it marks you, there's no escape. But myths are just myths. At least, that's what Alex believed. Alex was a nature photographer, passionate about capturing the raw beauty of uncharted landscapes. When he heard about the Sentinel Woods, he saw it as an opportunity. It was the perfect challenge, a forest no one dared to explore, shrouded in mystery. He dismissed the warnings as superstition, packing his gear and venturing in alone. The first day was uneventful. Alex hiked deep into the woods, marveling at its untouched beauty. The towering trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their thick canopies blocking out the sun. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth. But as night fell, the forest changed. The silence was the first thing Alex noticed. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet. Then came the feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first, a nagging thought in the back of his mind, but as the night stretched on, it grew impossible to ignore. While setting up his tent, Alex's flashlight caught something in the distance. Two glowing orbs, like embers in the dark, blinked back at him. His breath hitched. He aimed the light, but whatever it was had vanished. He shook his head, blaming his tired eyes. But deep down, he knew he wasn't alone. The following day, Alex pushed further into the forest, determined to finish his expedition. But the deeper he went, the stranger things became. The trees seemed to twist unnaturally, their bark etched with symbols he couldn't decipher. The ground was littered with animal bones, arranged in patterns that felt deliberate. The air itself felt heavier, pressing against his chest. And then he found it. At the heart of the forest stood an ancient shrine, overgrown with moss and vines. It was made of stone, cracked and weathered, but still imposing. At its center was an altar, surrounded by those same eerie symbols. Alex felt a strange pull, as if the shrine was alive, beckoning him closer. As he raised his camera to take a picture, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. A low growl echoed through the trees, primal and guttural. He spun around, and there it was, the Guardian. Its form defied explanation. It was both beast and spirit, its body covered in moss, bark, and fur. Antlers jutted from its head, twisted and jagged, and its glowing eyes burned with an intelligence that felt ancient and otherworldly. It didn't charge or roar. It simply stood there, watching him. Alex tried to run, but the forest wouldn't let him. Roots rose from the ground, branches clawed at his arms, and the air itself seemed to thicken, slowing his movements. The guardian stepped closer, and Alex felt his knees buckle under its presence. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." The creature tilted its head, as if considering his words. Then, with a swipe of its massive claws, it struck the camera from his hands, shattering it into pieces. Alex froze, expecting the next blow to end him, but it didn't come. Instead, the guardian turned and vanished into the shadows. Shaking, Alex stumbled back to the shrine. His hands trembled as he examined the altar, desperate for answers. That's when he saw the carvings, depictions of humans, forests, and a towering figure with antlers. He pieced it together. The guardian wasn't just a protector. It was a judge. The forest had chosen him, marked him for trespassing. As the sun began to set, Alex knew he had to leave. He retraced his steps, every sound and shadow sending his heart racing. The guardian didn't appear again, but its presence was palpable, as if the forest itself was watching his every move. When he finally emerged from the woods, he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. He looked back one last time and saw the glowing eyes in the distance, a silent warning to never return. Alex survived, but he wasn't the same. The experience haunted him, filling his dreams with visions of the guardian and the ancient forest. He told his story to anyone who would listen, hoping to warn others. But deep down, he knew the truth. The guardian didn't let him go out of mercy. It let him go because the forest had already taken what it wanted. The Sentinel Woods remain untouched to this day, its boundaries marked by fear and legend. And somewhere deep within, the forest guardian watches, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to trespass into its domain. Story number 3. What if I told you that your own shadow could betray you? That the dark outline you've always trusted to mimic your every move might one day decide to move on its own? They say shadows are harmless, a natural part of life, bound to you, inseparable. But what happens when a shadow gains a mind of its own? When it slips away from your feet and starts moving with a sinister purpose, hunting not just in the darkness but in broad daylight? It starts subtly. At first, you think it's just your imagination. You catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of your eye, but nothing's there. You laugh it off, blaming fatigue or poor lighting. But then the strange occurrences grow. Your shadow lingers when you walk away. Its shape distorts, elongates, almost as if it's watching you. And then, one night, you wake up. The room is still, bathed in moonlight, but something feels wrong. You glance at the wall, and your shadow isn't where it should be. Instead, it's on the ceiling, crawling, moving, coming closer. What would you do if you realized you were no longer safe in your own space? If the very thing meant to mirror your existence turned against you, hunting you relentlessly, feeding on your fear? In this video, we'll unravel the chilling tale of the crawling shadow, a dark entity that defies nature itself. Is it a curse? A supernatural being? Or something far more terrifying? Stick with me as we explore the story of those who encountered it and what happened when the light finally went out. But remember, when the shadow comes alive, running might not save you, because it already knows where you're going. Darkness has always been a part of life. It's something we accept, something we live with, but never truly question. Shadows are supposed to be harmless, nothing more than reflections of ourselves. But what happens when a shadow decides it's no longer bound to you? When it takes on a will of its own and starts hunting you like prey? This is exactly what happened to Ethan. Ethan was a 32-year-old graphic designer who lived a quiet, predictable life in the suburbs. He wasn't the type to believe in the paranormal. Ghost stories, urban legends, and creepy tales were just that, stories. But even skeptics can't ignore the truth when it's staring them in the face. It all started after a weekend hike. Ethan had gone to a remote forest to take photos, something he did often to relax. The trail he followed was deserted, the kind of place where silence wrapped around you like a thick blanket. As he explored deeper into the woods, he came across something unusual, a clearing where the trees stood unnaturally close together, their branches intertwining to block out the sun. In the center of the clearing, he found a stone slab, ancient and weathered, with strange symbols carved into its surface. Something about the place made him uneasy. The air felt colder, heavier. His own shadow seemed darker, more defined, as if the light couldn't quite touch it. Brushing off the feeling, Ethan took a few photos and left. But as he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the sensation that he wasn't alone. That night, the first incident happened. Ethan was brushing his teeth when he noticed his shadow in the mirror. At first, it seemed normal, moving in sync with him. But then, as he leaned down to spit, his shadow stood still. For a split second, it didn't move at all, until it slowly turned its head, as if watching him. Ethan froze, his toothbrush clattering into the sink. He stared at the shadow, heart pounding, but it was back to normal, mirroring his movements. Shaking his head, he laughed nervously. "I'm just tired," he thought, but deep down, he couldn't shake the unease. Over the next few days, the strangeness escalated. Ethan began noticing his shadow acting out of sync, lagging behind his movements or shifting unnaturally. Once, while working late at night, he saw it stretch across the wall in his peripheral vision, reaching for something invisible. One evening, while sitting on his couch, he noticed the shadow move across the floor. He wasn't moving, yet the shadow crept toward the wall, inching higher until it merged with the other shadows in the room. Ethan's stomach churned. It wasn't just out of sync anymore. It was acting on its own. Desperate for answers, Ethan turned to the internet. He scoured forums and articles, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. That's when he stumbled upon a thread about detached shadows. According to the post, shadows could sometimes become untethered, especially if disturbed by an ancient curse or supernatural force. The stories he read sent shivers down his spine. One user described how their shadow began moving independently after they visited a sacred site in the woods. The shadow became more aggressive over time, eventually stalking them until it consumed them completely. Ethan's blood ran cold. The descriptions matched his experiences perfectly. By now, Ethan's life was unraveling. He avoided dark spaces, leaving every light in his apartment on day and night. But it didn't matter. The shadow was relentless. It followed him everywhere, at work, in his car, even outside under the midday sun. It had grown larger, darker, more defined, as if feeding on something. Then, one fateful night, it struck. Ethan was lying in bed, exhausted, when he woke to an unnatural silence. The hum of his refrigerator, the ticking of his clock, everything had stopped. He opened his eyes and froze. The shadow was on the ceiling, crawling toward him. Its limbs were impossibly long, its movements slow and deliberate. Ethan's breath hitched as the figure dropped to the floor, standing at the foot of his bed. It was his shadow, but twisted, wrong. Its edges flickered like smoke, and where its face should have been was nothing but an abyss. Ethan bolted from his bed, grabbing his flashlight. He shone it directly at the figure, expecting it to disappear. But it didn't. The light didn't even seem to touch it. The shadow stood there, watching him without eyes, its presence suffocating. He ran out of the apartment, not caring about anything but getting away. He drove aimlessly, his hands trembling on the wheel. But no matter where he went, the shadow followed. He saw it in the rearview mirror, creeping along the walls of buildings, slipping through cracks and corners. Ethan's last hope was an old ritual he'd read about online. It required confronting the shadow in complete darkness, using only a single candle for protection. The idea terrified him, but he had no choice. He returned home and prepared. The lights were turned off, and a single candle burned in the center of the room. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, his heart hammering in his chest. The shadow appeared instantly, rising from the walls, its form twisting and writhing. It loomed over him, massive and oppressive, like a living void. Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to speak. "You don't own me," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm not afraid of you." The shadow froze. For a moment, the room was deathly silent. Then, it began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The candle flickered violently, and before Ethan could react, the room plunged into darkness. The last thing he saw was the shadow enveloping him, cold and suffocating. Ethan was never seen again. His apartment was left untouched, his belongings undisturbed, but there was no trace of him. Some say the shadow claimed him, dragging him into its realm. Others believe he became a shadow himself, cursed to roam the darkness, hunting for a new host. And so, the legend of the crawling shadow continues. It's not bound to one place or one person. It could be anywhere, waiting in the corners of your room, watching from the darkness. So, next time you catch your shadow moving out of sync, don't ignore it. Don't brush it off, because once it starts crawling, there's no escape. Story number 4. Claire had always been a practical person. A 30-year-old journalist, she believed in what she could see, touch, and verify. Supernatural events and ghost stories were mere entertainment to her, a distraction from the real world. She had no time for things she couldn't explain, until one night, the impossible found its way into her life. It began like any other evening. The city outside her apartment hummed with the usual night noises. Cars honking in the distance, people laughing in the streets, the occasional dog barking in the alley. Claire made herself a cup of tea, sat down with a book, and prepared for a quiet night in. The moon hung full in the sky, casting a gentle glow through her window. Everything felt normal. But then, as she curled up on the couch, something felt off. The usual hum of the world outside seemed to quiet down, and an inexplicable chill spread across the room. It was subtle at first, the air growing just a little colder, but Claire could feel it. She dismissed it at first, probably just the air conditioning kicking in, but it didn't feel right. She glanced toward the window, which was slightly cracked open to let in the cool night air. A soft breeze ruffled the curtains, but as her eyes scanned the room, something caught her attention. There, at the edge of the curtain, a figure stood just beyond the window, pale, almost ethereal. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She froze. At first, she thought it might be a trick of the light. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision. But no, there it was again. A figure. The moonlight illuminated it in a strange, almost glowing way. The figure was tall, impossibly still, and its skin seemed to shimmer with an unnatural glow. A pale face, gaunt and hollow, gazed back at her through the glass. The figure had no expression, no emotion in its eyes, just a cold, empty stare. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She tried to move, to step away, but her body felt paralyzed, as though the air had turned to lead. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching her through the window, its presence filling the room with a heavy, suffocating energy. Her mind raced. "It's just my imagination," she told herself, maybe a reflection from the streetlight outside. But the longer she stared, the more she felt the weight of those eyes on her, as though they were piercing her soul, knowing everything about her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, but the air felt thicker now, colder. She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling as she slowly made her way to the window. As Claire moved closer to the glass, she realized just how wrong everything felt. Her heart thudded in her chest as her hand reached for the curtain. She wanted to pull it back, to see who or what was outside. But some primal instinct inside her screamed to stop. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing the fabric of the curtain, but she pulled it open anyway. The figure was gone. She looked outside into the empty street, the dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk. There was no one, nothing, just the quiet, empty night. Claire's breath released in a shaky sigh of relief. It had been nothing, just a trick of the light. She shook her head at herself for being so foolish, but as she turned to head back to the couch, she caught something in the reflection of the glass. The figure wasn't gone. It was still there. In the reflection of the window, she saw it clearly now, standing just outside, motionless. The same gaunt face, the same empty eyes staring back at her. The figure wasn't outside anymore. It had crossed the threshold, standing just behind her, almost in the room with her. She whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was nothing there. She was alone, but the presence of the figure lingered. The room felt colder, the air thicker. Claire could hear her own shallow breathing as she glanced nervously back at the window. Was it still there? Was it waiting for her? The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as the silence stretched on, suffocating and complete. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the eerie stillness pressing in from all sides. Every creak of the house, every shift in the air made her jump. The fear, irrational but all-consuming, held her captive. She couldn't explain it, couldn't even begin to understand what she had seen. But she knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human. The following days passed in a blur. Claire went to work, tried to focus on her tasks, but her mind constantly wandered back to the pale figure. She began to notice things she hadn't before. Small, subtle signs that something was wrong. The feeling of being watched grew stronger every day, as though the figure was always just behind her, waiting for the right moment. And then, one night, it came back. Claire had just finished dinner and was settling in to watch a movie. The evening felt calm, normal, until the chill returned. She couldn't explain it, but the air felt heavier, colder. She glanced at the window. The figure was there again. This time, closer than ever, standing right at the edge of the glass, its face pressed against it as though it was inside her home. Claire's heart raced as the figure's eyes bore into hers, unblinking and cold. She felt a sense of dread washing over her, a growing unease that curled in her stomach. She didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to believe what was happening, but she couldn't deny the truth any longer. The Pale Watcher wasn't just a ghostly figure. It was something else, something ancient and relentless. And it had found her. That night, Claire locked all the doors and windows, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every time she looked out her window, she saw it. Always there, always watching. No matter how much she tried to ignore it, the figure stayed, like a shadow just out of reach. One day, Claire began to research, desperately seeking answers. She combed through old local folklore, online accounts, and books about hauntings. What she found sent shivers down her spine. People all over town, people who had lived in the apartments before her, had seen the same figure. The Pale Watcher, a spirit that appeared only at night, watching from the windows, waiting for the right moment. Some believed it was an omen of death, others that it was a vengeful soul trapped in the reflection of the glass. But none of the stories offered any real explanation for the figure's true nature or why it seemed so drawn to certain people. As days passed, Claire began to change. She became withdrawn, anxious, and exhausted. The Pale Watcher had a way of draining her spirit, making her feel more alone with every passing day. It didn't matter where she went. The figure always found her. Then, one night, Claire finally gathered the courage to confront it. She stood before the window, her hands trembling but determined. "I know you're there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do you want from me?" For a long moment, nothing happened. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. But then, slowly, it began to shift, its pale form becoming more defined in the moonlight. The figure's eyes, those hollow, unblinking eyes, stared directly into her soul, and Claire heard the voice. "I watch, I wait, until you see me, until you acknowledge me." The room went cold. The shadows in the corners grew longer, creeping along the walls. Claire felt her legs buckle beneath her as the figure's presence enveloped her. Her vision blurred, and before she could react, everything went black. She was never seen again. Some say the Pale Watcher claimed her, taking her into the realm between worlds. Others believe that Claire became a part of it, another ghostly figure, standing at the window, waiting for the next soul to acknowledge her. But one thing is certain. Once the Pale Watcher has seen you, you're never truly alone again. Story number 5. Have you ever felt a drop of water on your skin when there was no rain? Heard the faint sound of dripping in the dead silence of a dry room? Most of us brush these off as tricks of the mind or faulty plumbing. But what if they were something else, something darker? In the shadows of forgotten places, where silence reigns and the air grows unnaturally cold, whispers of a mysterious figure circulate. Locals call it the Drowned One, a creature born of tragedy, forever trapped in a watery abyss, yet walking among us. They say it doesn't need rain or rivers to exist. It brings its own water, dripping endlessly, leaving a trail of damp fear wherever it roams. Some claim to have seen it, a human-like figure soaked to the bone, water pouring from its form even in the driest of spaces. They report its presence in abandoned homes, empty hallways, or even their own bedrooms late at night. The unlucky few who encounter it describe a feeling of suffocation, as if drowning without ever being submerged. And its legend carries a chilling warning. Once you notice the dripping, it's already too late. The Drowned One doesn't just haunt, it claims. Its victims vanish, swallowed into its watery realm, their fate unknown. Tonight, we'll dive into its eerie tale. Who, or what, is this dripping specter? What does it want? And why can't anyone who meets it ever escape? Stay with me as we uncover the haunting story of the Drowned One. But beware, if you hear the sound of water dripping while you watch this, you might already have its attention. It started as a faint sound, something easily ignored, a soft, dripping noise that seemed to come from nowhere. Clara had just moved into her apartment, a modest but charming unit tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The neighbors were distant, and the building itself was old, but it suited her needs perfectly, or so she thought. On her first night, as she unpacked her belongings, she noticed the sound. A single drip, then another, echoing faintly in the stillness. She checked the kitchen faucet, dry. The bathroom sink, nothing. Shrugging it off, she continued her tasks, convinced it was just the old plumbing acting up. But the sound persisted. Over the following days, the dripping grew louder, more insistent. It no longer felt random, as though it was building toward something. Clara began to notice strange occurrences around her home. Her mirrors would fog over, even when the apartment was warm. Her floors felt damp in places, though she found no leaks. Worse, there was a chill in the air that didn't dissipate, even under the heat of summer. Then, one morning, she woke up to find a puddle of water beneath her bed. It was small, but enough to soak the edges of the rug. Confused and slightly unnerved, Clara called her landlord, who assured her there was no history of leaks or water damage in the building. Still, the puddle grew larger the next night, and again the following morning. No matter how much she cleaned, the water reappeared, spreading inch by inch. She began to hear things at night. The dripping sound was now accompanied by faint whispers, muffled and distant, like a voice submerged underwater. At first, she convinced herself it was her imagination. But one night, as she lay in bed, she heard her name, Clara. The whisper was unmistakable, low and gurgling, as though spoken through a throat filled with water. Her blood ran cold. She bolted upright, heart pounding, but her room was empty. Only the sound of dripping water remained, louder now, echoing through the walls. Clara's days became consumed by a growing paranoia. She avoided being home at night, spending hours wandering the city until exhaustion forced her to return. But no matter where she went, she couldn't escape the sound. Even in the park, far from her apartment, she heard it, drip, drip, drip. One evening, as she returned home, Clara froze at her front door. There was water seeping out from underneath, pooling in the hallway. She unlocked the door with trembling hands and stepped inside. Her apartment was flooded, not with inches of water, but an impossible dampness that soaked the walls, the floor, and even the ceiling. The dripping sound was deafening now, reverberating all around her. And then she saw it. In the corner of her living room stood a figure. It was human-shaped but wrong, its body blurred and shifting like a reflection in rippling water. It dripped constantly, water pouring from its form onto the floor. Clara felt her knees weaken as the figure turned toward her, its face, or what should have been its face, hidden beneath a veil of liquid. She tried to run, but her feet slipped on the wet floor. The figure moved closer, gliding effortlessly across the waterlogged space. Its presence brought with it an unbearable cold, seeping into her bones. Clara screamed as it reached out, its fingers impossibly long and dripping. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of rushing water. The figure didn't answer, but she felt its voice inside her mind. A cacophony of crashing waves, rushing tides, and drowning gasps. "You ignored the signs," it whispered. "Now you are mine." The water rose around her, icy and relentless. Clara clawed at the walls, the floor, desperate to find air. But the room had become an endless abyss. The last thing she saw before being pulled under was the figure's eyes, dark, endless pools that reflected her fear. The next morning, her apartment was empty. Her landlord, frustrated by her sudden disappearance, found only damp walls and a faint puddle in the middle of the room. No sign of Clara, no explanation for the waterlogged state of the space. But locals in the area began to notice something strange. The sound of dripping water could now be heard faintly in the building, even on the driest of days. Some neighbors reported wet footprints appearing in their own homes, trailing from one room to another before vanishing. And a few swore they saw a figure standing in their windows at night. A figure soaked to the bone, watching silently. They say the drowned one takes those who ignore the warning signs. The puddles that reappear, the whispers in the night, the cold that lingers. It doesn't leave a trace, only a chilling reminder of its presence. And if you ever hear the sound of dripping water in a place where there shouldn't be any, remember Clara's story. Because once the drowned one notices you, it's already too late. Story number 6. Have you ever felt an inexplicable shiver when you walk through a cobweb? Or caught sight of a spider moving eerily, as though it knows something you don't? We brush them aside, calling them pests. But what if there's a reason they watch us with so many unblinking eyes? What if, in the shadows of the world, there is someone, or something, pulling their strings? In whispered legends and forgotten tales, there is mention of a being known only as the Spider Queen. Some say she was once human, a woman betrayed by those she trusted, left to die in the depths of a spider-infested cavern. But instead of death, she found something darker, a connection to the crawling, skittering creatures that surrounded her. Now, she's their ruler, their mother, and their weapon. The Spider Queen is said to command her 8-legged minions with a mere thought. Her will becomes theirs, and her vengeance knows no bounds. Spiders appear where they shouldn't, weaving intricate webs of fear. Those who cross her path often vanish, leaving behind nothing but a dense cocoon of silk and a lingering sense of dread. But the Spider Queen isn't content with her hidden realm. They say she is searching, looking for more humans to weave into her dark plans. Perhaps you've already encountered her influence. That spider you crushed on your wall? It might have been watching you on her behalf. Stay with me as we unravel the chilling tale of the Spider Queen, a woman who commands the things we fear most. But be warned, if you feel the tickle of legs on your skin, she might already know you're watching. In the heart of the black hollow forest, time seems to stop. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the silence is broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. But among the villagers who live near its edge, the forest is known for something far darker. A presence that watches from the shadows, a legend that sends shivers down spines. They call her the Spider Queen. Long ago, before the Spider Queen became a nightmare whispered in hushed tones, there was Isolde, a healer known for her gentle hands and unmatched knowledge of nature's cures. Her garden flourished with herbs, flowers, and roots, and her home was a sanctuary for the sick and wounded. But kindness is not a shield against envy and fear. When crops failed one summer and the villagers fell ill, they turned to Isolde for help. But when her remedies did not save them all, the whispers began. Some claimed she had cursed the land out of spite. Others said she consorted with dark forces to gain her knowledge. One fateful night, a child fell gravely ill, and the villagers, desperate and grieving, turned on Isolde, which they accused her. "You brought this upon us." They dragged her to the edge of the forest, ignoring her pleas and protests. There, at the mouth of the forbidden cave, a place no one dared enter, they cast her inside. Let the spiders judge her, they jeered, their torches lighting her tear-streaked face as she disappeared into the darkness. The cave was a labyrinth of shadows and silence, but it was far from empty. Isolde stumbled through the dark, her breath shallow, her heart racing. The air was thick with the faint hiss of movement, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. As her eyes adjusted, she saw them. Thousands of spiders, their eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. She tried to stay calm, but her fear was palpable, her movements frantic as she attempted to escape. Deeper she went, drawn by some unseen force, until she reached the heart of the cavern. There, in a hollow bathed in an unnatural glow, she encountered it, the brood mother. The creature was immense, its body pulsating with unnatural life, its legs stretched impossibly long, its eyes reflecting a cruel intelligence. Isolde froze, her body trembling as the spider loomed over her. But instead of attacking, it paused, as though sensing her pain, her anger, her desperation. And then it spoke, not with words, but through a connection that pierced her mind. The brood mother offered her a choice: die as a victim, forgotten and betrayed, or rise as something greater, something feared. With nothing left to lose, Isolde accepted. The transformation was agonizing. The brood mother wove her in its silk, cocooning her in layers of web that tightened and pulsed with dark energy. Hours, perhaps days, passed as Isolde's body and mind were reshaped. When the cocoon finally broke, she emerged as the Spider Queen. A being neither human nor beast, her soul bound to the spiders that now served her every command. Her revenge was swift. The first to fall were the villagers who had cast her out. Spiders poured from the forest in an endless wave, crawling through windows, under doors, and into the very beds of those who had wronged her. They worked with precision, weaving webs that bound their victims in silken prisons. By morning, the village was silent, the streets eerily empty. But the Spider Queen's wrath did not end there. She expanded her reach, her brood spreading across the forest and beyond. Travelers spoke of webs appearing in places they hadn't been before, of spiders moving in patterns too deliberate to be natural. Some claimed to see a figure in the trees, cloaked in black silk, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Among the stories, one stands out, a tale of a merchant who stumbled into the forest at dusk. He returned weeks later, his body intact but his mind shattered. He spoke of a voice that echoed in his head, commanding him to kneel, to obey. "She is coming," he whispered before vanishing again, leaving behind a trail of spider silk. The Spider Queen's influence grows stronger with each passing year. Some say she seeks vengeance not just on the villagers who wronged her, but on all humanity for its cruelty and ignorance. Others believe she is building an army, her spiders infiltrating homes and cities to prepare for a larger, more devastating attack. And what of the spiders you see in your home? The ones that skitter across your walls or hide in the corners of your ceiling. They could be ordinary pests, or they could be her eyes, watching, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. For if the Spider Queen has chosen you, there is no escape. Her web stretches far and wide, and once you are caught in it, you belong to her forever. So the next time you feel the tickle of legs on your skin, think twice before you swat it away. It might be carrying her message, a warning that your time is running out. Story number 7. Have you ever felt the eerie silence of the woods? A silence so heavy it feels like something is watching you? Deep within the shadowy heart of forgotten forests and abandoned graveyards lurks a being whispered about in hushed voices. A creature so ancient and malevolent, It has no name among the living, but the echoes of its deeds have earned it a chilling title, the Bone Collector. Legends say it moves through the night with an unnatural grace, its hollow eyes glowing faintly under the moonlight. No sound announces its arrival, only the dreadful realization that something is missing. It doesn't feed on flesh or blood. Instead, it craves the essence locked within bones, the very foundation of life. Each bone it collects makes it stronger, more powerful, and more horrifying. The Bone Collector is not bound by mercy or morality. It has no interest in why you crossed its path, whether by accident or fate. Once it marks you, it begins its silent hunt. People say it doesn't just take the bones of its victims. It absorbs the memories, the soul imprints, leaving behind hollowed-out shells of what once were vibrant beings. But what makes it even more terrifying is its insatiable hunger. As it grows stronger, so does its need to collect more. It's not just bones it seeks anymore. It hunts for something greater. What would you do if you found yourself face to face with this ancient collector of life's foundations? Could you escape its grasp? Or would your bones, too, become a part of its grotesque collection? Stay tuned as we uncover the chilling origins, the myths, and the horrifying truths about the Bone Collector. Let's dive into the darkness together, if you dare. The sun had barely set behind the jagged peaks surrounding Black Hollow when the whispers began again. The townsfolk huddled in their homes, bolting their doors and shutting their windows tight, as if such feeble measures could keep out the ancient terror that stalked the nearby whispering woods. Black Hollow had always been a quiet place, nestled far from the bustle of cities, surrounded by misty hills and thick forests. But this quiet wasn't born of peace. It was the kind of silence that came from fear. And that fear had a name, the Bone Collector. The legend of the Bone Collector stretched back generations. The oldest among the townsfolk spoke of a time when the forest was just a forest before the creature appeared. No one knew exactly where it had come from, but everyone knew what it wanted. Bones. Not just for sustenance, but for power. The creature didn't just consume bones. It absorbed them, using their strength to rebuild itself, growing larger, faster, and deadlier with every victim. But what was truly terrifying was its cunning. The Bone Collector wasn't an aimless beast. It was a predator, choosing its prey carefully, sometimes stalking them for days before making its move. It didn't simply attack, it hunted. One crisp autumn day, a newcomer named Nathan arrived in Black Hollow. A historian with a passion for local legends, he was determined to uncover the truth behind the stories. To him, the Bone Collector was a tale exaggerated over time, a mix of fear and folklore. Armed with his research tools and unshakable curiosity, he began interviewing the locals. At first, no one would speak to him. The mere mention of the Bone Collector's name was enough to make shopkeepers fall silent and old men clutch their crosses. Eventually, he found Elias, an old woodcarver who had lived in Black Hollow his entire life. Elias was frail, his voice barely a whisper, but his eyes burned with the intensity of someone who had seen too much. "You think it's just a story?" Elias rasped, staring at Nathan with a mix of pity and anger. "You don't understand. It's not about belief. It's about survival." Elias recounted the tale of the Bone Collector, a being that once may have been human, cursed, or twisted by an ancient ritual gone wrong. It roamed the forests, seeking bones to replace its decaying form. Over the centuries, it had become something far beyond human, an abomination of bone and shadow, driven by an insatiable hunger. Nathan listened intently, his skepticism waning. But despite the warning, his curiosity only grew. He resolved to venture into the whispering woods to find proof of the creature's existence. The forest was a labyrinth of towering trees and tangled undergrowth, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. As Nathan ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew oppressive. The birdsong ceased, replaced by an eerie stillness broken only by the occasional snap of a twig beneath his boots. Hours passed before he stumbled upon something chilling, a clearing littered with bones. They were arranged in patterns too deliberate to be natural, circles, spirals, and shapes that seemed almost ritualistic. He knelt to examine them, his heart pounding. Some of the bones were old, yellowed with age, but others were fresh, still stained with traces of flesh. Then came the sound, a soft clicking, rhythmic and deliberate, like the tapping of bones against one another. It echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing second. Nathan froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he turned, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the bone collector. It was taller than he had imagined, its form a grotesque collage of bones fused together, moving as though controlled by some unseen force. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, glowed faintly in the darkness, and its skeletal frame seemed to shift and reassemble with every step it took. Nathan backed away, his mind racing for an escape plan. But the creature moved with an unnatural speed, closing the distance in a heartbeat. Its clawed hand lashed out, and Nathan barely managed to dodge, stumbling over the scattered bones. Desperation took over. Nathan grabbed a femur from the ground and swung it wildly, but the bone collector barely flinched. The creature seemed to absorb the strike, as if drawing strength from the very object Nathan had used against it. Realizing he couldn't fight it, Nathan turned and ran, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The forest seemed to conspire against him, roots and branches snagging at his feet. Behind him, the clicking sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint sound of bones grinding together. Nathan's screams echoed through the forest, but by the time the search party found his belongings the next morning, there was no trace of him. His notebook lay open, its final pages filled with frantic scribbles. It's real. It's watching. It's unstoppable. A week later, new arrangements of bones appeared near the town's edge. They formed shapes that resembled a human figure holding a book. The people of Black Hollow knew what it meant. The bone collector had claimed another victim and grown stronger. From that day forward, no one ventured into the whispering woods. The townsfolk lit lanterns at night and whispered prayers to unseen gods, hoping to keep the bone collector at bay. But deep down, they knew the truth. The bone collector wasn't just a story. It was a promise. And in the darkness of the forest, it waited, ever hungry, ever patient, for the next soul foolish enough to stray too close. Story number 8. Imagine walking through a crowded street, the hustle and bustle of life surrounding you. People rush by, their faces familiar, their voices clear, yet there's something unsettling in the air, something you can't quite place. You glance at someone, and they look just like any other person. They smile, they nod, but as your eyes meet theirs, you feel a cold, unnatural emptiness. It's as if their gaze isn't entirely theirs, as if something is missing, hollow behind their eyes. You try to ignore it, to brush it off as nothing more than a trick of the mind. But then, you notice more of them. They're everywhere. Figures that resemble humans in every way, yet their presence doesn't sit right. They move too perfectly, too fluidly, their actions almost too calculated, too precise. You could almost convince yourself that they're ordinary, If not for one chilling detail, there's nothing inside. They are the hollow ones, figures that look human, but inside they are empty. Their bodies are mere shells, vessels that once might have been alive, but now are nothing more than a hollow facade. These beings live among us, unnoticed by most, blending in with the crowd. But to those who can see beyond the surface, the truth is terrifying. They are empty. What happens when these empty shells walk past you? When they speak to you? Or when one locks eyes with you, and you realize you're not looking at a person at all? The hollow ones don't just exist in the shadows. They walk among us, and the more we fail to notice them, the stronger they become. This isn't just a story. This is a warning. Stay with me as we uncover the truth about the hollow ones, and why they may be closer than you think. The darkness behind their eyes is waiting, and it's waiting for you to see it. Dreary Hollow had always been a quiet town. Nestled between shadowy hills and dense forests, it was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. But despite its tranquility, a certain unease hung in the air, a tension that none of the residents could explain. It wasn't just the eerie howls that echoed through the woods at night, nor was it the old stories of cursed lands and long-forgotten gods. No, it was something far more sinister, something far more terrifying. It was the hollow ones. They weren't easy to spot at first. They looked like anyone you might pass on the street, a neighbor, a friend, a stranger, until you looked closer. Their eyes were the first clue, cold, blank, as if they had never known what it meant to truly see. Their smiles, too, were unsettlingly perfect, stretched across their faces like a mask, but it never reached their eyes. They spoke in a calm, mechanical tone, their words lacking the warmth and depth of human emotion. At first, it was just a few people who seemed off, but as the days went by, more of them appeared. Figures who blended in seamlessly with the crowd, never attracting attention, yet always present. They moved through the town like shadows, drifting through the streets, standing in places where no one remembered seeing them arrive. The residents of Dreary Hollow had learned to ignore them, to pretend they didn't exist. After all, if you didn't acknowledge them, if you didn't look too closely, maybe they'd leave you alone. But Anna couldn't ignore them. She had moved to Dreary Hollow only a few months ago, searching for a fresh start away from the chaos of city life. She had heard the whispers, of course, the strange rumors about people who weren't quite people, but she had dismissed them as nonsense, the kind of talk that flourishes in small towns with too much time on their hands. It wasn't until the first time she saw one of them up close that the fear began to seep in. It was a Friday afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky as Anna made her way home from work. The streets were busy with the usual crowd. Mothers pushing strollers, children chasing each other down the sidewalk, and old men sitting on benches, talking softly about the weather. But then, as she passed by the local bakery, she saw him. He was standing on the corner, just outside the shop, his back straight, his eyes staring into the distance. Anna felt a chill run down her spine as she locked eyes with him. There was something so wrong about him. His face was smooth, perfectly symmetrical, but his eyes were hollow, empty. There was no depth, no spark of life, just an abyss. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just her imagination. But the next day, she saw another one, and then another. They were everywhere, walking down the street, sitting in the park, even standing behind the counters of local stores, their eyes never blinking, never changing. It was as if they were waiting. Her suspicions grew stronger as she noticed more details. The way they moved was too perfect, too calculated. Their gestures were stiff, as though they were following a script that they had long memorized. And the more Anna watched them, the more she realized they weren't just different from ordinary people. They were empty. There was no essence behind their eyes, no soul, no heart. One evening, after a long day, Anna decided to go for a walk through the town to clear her mind. It was a quiet night, the kind of night where the moon cast long shadows over the cobbled streets. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She turned down an alley, hoping to lose whoever was behind her, but when she looked over her shoulder, there was no one there. Then, at the end of the alley, she saw him again, the man from the bakery. This time, he was standing under the dim light of a street lamp, his face illuminated by the eerie glow. As she approached, he turned toward her, and for the first time, his lips parted to speak. "You've been watching," he said, his voice smooth and cold, like polished stone. Anna froze. She had never spoken to him before. How did he know she was watching him? "You're not like the others," he continued, stepping closer. "You see us, don't you? You see that we are empty, that we are nothing." Anna took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. "You're wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "You're just like everyone else. You're human." The man's smile never faltered, but there was something unsettling about it now. It was too wide, too perfect. It wasn't a smile, it was a mask. "We were once human," he said, his voice lowering. "But that was long ago. We are the hollow ones now. We have no past, no future, no soul. We simply exist. And soon you will too." With that, he turned and walked away, his steps too smooth, too deliberate, as if he had rehearsed them 1,000 times. Anna watched him disappear into the darkness, a cold sweat forming on her skin. The next few days passed in a blur of dread. Everywhere Anna went, she saw them. The hollow ones. They were always just there, lurking in the background, watching her, waiting. She couldn't escape the feeling that they were closing in, that they were following her every move. Desperately, she began researching the town's history. She dug through old records, spoke to the locals, but no one would say much. There were whispers, though, whispers of a curse that had descended upon Dreary Hollow long ago. A curse that had turned people into these soulless husks, these hollow ones. The more Anna learned, the more she understood that the hollow ones weren't just here in Dreary Hollow. They were everywhere. They could blend in, walk among us, and no one would notice. They were waiting for the right moment, for the right person, to take their place. Because when you become one of the hollow ones, you lose everything. Your soul, your memories, your identity, all of it is swallowed by the emptiness inside you. And once you become one, there's no going back. You're just another shell, wandering through life, waiting for someone else to take your place. Anna's fear reached its peak when, one night, she walked into her home to find the hollow one standing in her living room. The man in the suit. His face was empty, just like the others, but this time, it was different. This time, she felt something worse than fear. She felt familiarity. She looked closer and realized she had seen this man before. In the mirror, in the window, in the reflection she had never noticed. It was her. She had become one of them. Story number 9. Have you ever encountered someone who smiled at you, but the longer you looked, the more uneasy it made you feel? It's as though their smile wasn't just a simple expression of happiness. It was something other, something unnatural. Their lips curl upward, showing perfect, white teeth. But there's something missing behind those eyes. Something that shouldn't be there. You try to look away, but the smile seems to stay locked on your mind, following you long after you've turned your back. In every town, in every crowd, there are people who seem different, out of place. Some call them the smiling stranger. They walk among us, their faces always frozen in an unsettling, too perfect grin. The kind of smile that isn't warm or inviting, but cold, like a mask concealing something far darker underneath. People have seen them at bus stops, in cafes, and even in their own homes, lurking just outside their windows or standing silently at the edge of a crowd. Their presence sends chills down your spine, and yet you can't look away. But what happens when the smile never fades? What if the smiling stranger is not just a passing figure, but someone who deliberately seeks you out? They don't just smile for a moment, they linger, like they're waiting for something. Their smile remains locked in place, unwavering, even as everything else around them seems to shift and warp. What do they want? And why do they never stop smiling? Stay with me as we uncover the terrifying truth behind the smiling stranger. What's behind that frozen grin, and what happens when you get too close? Trust me, you'll want to know before it's too late. It was late in the evening when Mark first saw him. He was walking home after a long shift at the diner, tired but relieved to finally be heading back to his apartment. The streets were nearly empty, and the only sound was the crunch of his boots against the frosty ground. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the quiet town. He had walked this path countless times before, but tonight, something felt off. A strange chill was in the air, sharper than usual, and the silence seemed heavier, as if the night itself was holding its breath. And then he saw him. At the corner of Maple Street and Thorn Avenue, there was a figure standing under the streetlight. He was tall, his silhouette slightly obscured by the shadows, but it was the smile that immediately drew Mark's attention. It was wide, too wide, and it didn't look right. It wasn't the warm, familiar smile you might share with a friend or even a stranger. No, this smile was unsettling. It was frozen, almost unnatural, stretched across a face that seemed too perfect. At first, Mark thought it was just some weirdo hanging around the street corner, but as he walked closer, he began to feel an uncomfortable pull. The figure didn't move, didn't twitch, didn't even blink. The smile remained constant, as if it was carved into the person's face. He tried to convince himself it was nothing. People smile, right? But this smile, it wasn't like any smile he had ever seen. It felt wrong, as though the person wasn't even aware they were smiling. It was as if the smile belonged to something, or someone else. Mark walked past the figure, his heart racing just a little faster, but he couldn't help but look over his shoulder. And that's when it happened. The figure turned its head slowly, deliberately, to face him. The smile never wavered. It stayed the same, wide and unnerving, like something that shouldn't belong. Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He didn't know why, but the longer he looked, the more unsettled he became. The smile was staring at him, piercing through the distance between them, and for a moment, Mark felt like he was caught in the figure's gaze, like a fly in a web. He quickened his pace, eager to put more distance between himself and that figure. But as he turned the corner, something made him look back again. The figure was still there, standing motionless under the flickering street lamp. The smile was still there, frozen, unchanging. The next few days passed in a blur. Mark tried to shake the encounter off, telling himself that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. People smiled all the time. It was nothing, but deep down, he knew that wasn't the truth. The memory of that face, that smile, lingered like a shadow in the back of his mind, growing darker with each passing day. He started seeing it in his dreams. The same wide grin, the same still face, watching him from the corner of his room, from the end of his bed, never blinking. And sometimes he could hear a faint laugh in the distance, soft and haunting. He told a few friends about the encounter, but they just laughed it off. Maybe it was just someone playing a prank, they said, or a weird guy on the street. It's nothing to worry about, but Mark wasn't so sure. Something about it felt different. The way the figure had looked at him, watched him, didn't feel like a simple interaction. It was as though it was waiting for him to react, waiting for him to notice. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the smile hadn't been just an accident. It had been deliberate. One evening, just a week later, Mark found himself walking down the same street again. It had been raining earlier, and the pavement was slick with water. The streets were quieter than usual, the usual bustle of the town replaced by the eerie quiet of an empty, drizzly evening. As he passed the street lamp on Maple Street, he saw the figure again. But this time, it wasn't standing still. This time, the man was walking toward him, his slow, deliberate steps making no sound as he crossed the wet pavement. The same eerie, frozen smile spread across his face. Mark's heart skipped a beat. There was no mistaking it. This was the same man, the one from days ago, the one with the unblinking eyes and the grin that seemed to stretch on forever. "Do you need help?" Mark found himself asking, his voice shaking, his instincts telling him to run, but his body paralyzed with a strange mix of fear and curiosity. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it continued to walk toward him, its smile never fading. Closer, closer it came, until it was standing right in front of him. Mark could feel his chest tighten, his breath shallow. "Who are you?" Mark finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, smiling. "Why are you smiling like that?" Mark asked again, feeling foolish, but desperate for an explanation. The man's smile only grew wider, if that was even possible. It was now a grotesque distortion of a normal expression, stretching unnaturally, like the lips were being pulled back by invisible strings. But still, he didn't speak. Mark tried to take a step back, but he felt something, a strange pressure, like an invisible force keeping him rooted to the spot. The figure's smile filled his entire field of vision, consuming everything else around him. He couldn't escape it. The man was still staring at him, that empty, eerie grin fixed in place. Mark felt his heartbeat quicken, but no matter how much he tried to move, his feet wouldn't obey. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the figure turned around and walked away, its movements slow and deliberate. Mark stood there, frozen, unable to process what had just happened. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the stranger's retreating figure. The smile remained, even as the man disappeared into the shadows. It was as if the man wasn't just walking away. He was vanishing into thin air, taking the smile with him, leaving nothing behind but the lingering feeling of cold dread. Over the next few days, Mark couldn't escape the smile. Everywhere he went, he saw it in the corner of his eye. He saw it in reflections, on windows, on mirrors, in the glass of his phone. It was always there, hovering just out of reach. No matter how hard he tried to shake it, he couldn't escape it. The smile had become a part of his life, a presence that followed him wherever he went. Then, one night, as he lay in bed, Mark heard it. A soft laugh, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere in the room. He bolted upright, his breath quick and shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, and for a moment, everything was silent. But then, in the darkness, he saw it. The smile, wide and frozen, just inches from his face. His body went cold. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't move. The last thing he remembered was the sound of soft laughter echoing in the room, followed by the sensation of cold fingers brushing against his face. And then, nothing. The next morning, Mark was gone. His apartment was found in complete disarray, but there was no sign of him. No footprints in the mud, no sign of a struggle. The only thing left behind was the faintest, lingering echo of a smile burned into the walls. Some say Mark disappeared because of the smiling stranger. Others say he became one of them, because once you see the smile, once it becomes a part of you, it never fades. And neither do they. Story number 10. Have you ever been walking down a quiet street late at night, the air heavy with silence, when you suddenly feel watched? That sense that something is lurking just out of sight, a presence that you can't see but can feel breathing down your neck? You look around, but there's nothing there. Still, you can't shake the feeling. And then, without warning, you hear it. A sound like footsteps, but not from the ground. The sound is coming from above, from the rooftops. Most of us never think about what's happening above our heads. We walk through life, our eyes focused on the ground or the horizon, never thinking to look up. But there's something up there, something that lives on the rooftops, something that's been there for years, creeping around in the dark corners of our cities, never coming down to join the rest of us. It doesn't belong with the people on the streets, with the crowds, or with the lives that unfold below. No, this thing stays hidden, always watching, always waiting from the high places above. The rooftop creeper doesn't walk like us. It moves silently, its limbs stretching and crawling in ways no human ever could. It knows the dark corners of every building, every alley, every rooftop. It doesn't come down to ground level. It doesn't need to, because it's always above, always watching. But what happens when you start to notice it? What happens when you look up and see those glowing eyes staring down at you from the roof? What happens when the rooftop creeper decides it's time to come closer, closer than it's ever been before? Stay with me, and I'll reveal the terrifying truth behind the rooftop creeper. Keep watching, because once it's noticed you, you won't be able to look up without feeling its eyes on you, forever. It was a late evening when the first report surfaced. Nothing too extraordinary at first. Just a vague mention of strange sounds coming from rooftops at night. Something faint but unsettling. A few people had noticed it. The sound of scraping, dragging footsteps, as though something, or someone, was moving across the rooftops. At first, it was dismissed as a cat or some other small animal scavenging at the high places of the city. But then, as the days passed, it became clear that something more sinister was afoot. The sounds were not the random movements of an animal. They were deliberate, calculated, and at times, impossibly fast. Tessa lived on the top floor of a 4-story apartment building. She'd always loved the view, the way the city looked from above, the calmness of the rooftops in contrast to the busy streets below. It was a nice, quiet area, tucked away from the chaos of downtown, and she'd grown used to the peaceful sounds of the neighborhood at night. The occasional car passing, the distant chatter of friends hanging out in the street, and the hum of the city always in the background. But recently, something had changed. The atmosphere felt different. It was subtle at first. A soft shuffle on the rooftops, the kind of noise you might dismiss if you weren't paying attention. But the sounds began to grow louder and more frequent. Tessa had been walking home from the corner store one evening when she first heard it. The unmistakable sound of scraping, a dragging noise that seemed to come from somewhere above. At first, She thought it was the wind or maybe the old pipes on the roof creaking. But then the scraping turned into something far more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was walking across the edge of the building above her, but just out of sight. She stopped, her heart pounding. The street was quiet, too quiet. She looked up, her breath hitching as her eyes scanned the rooftop of the apartment building. Nothing. The roof was empty. The sound stopped almost immediately. Tessa forced herself to calm down, reminding herself that it was probably just an animal. Cats were known to climb up to the rooftops around here. It wasn't unusual, but over the next few nights, the sounds became harder to ignore. Each time she returned home, she would hear the same scraping noises, always from above, always just out of view. One night, she even heard the sound of something breathing, deep, slow breaths, as if whatever was on the roof was waiting, listening, watching. The sensation of being watched began to gnaw at her. There was a chilling feeling in the air every time she stepped out of her apartment. One night, unable to ignore her growing unease, Tessa decided to investigate. She grabbed her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the dark stairwell as she climbed up to the rooftop door. The cool night air hit her as soon as she stepped outside, and the eerie quiet of the city stretched out before her. She hesitated, standing in the doorway, her heart thudding in her chest. That's when she heard it again. The unmistakable sound of something crawling across the roof above her head. This time, it was louder, clearer. It was moving in a way that didn't sound like an animal at all. The noise wasn't erratic or scared, like an animal trying to escape. It was smooth, controlled, like it was deliberately moving across the roof, as though it had been doing this for a long time. Tessa slowly turned her head towards the edge of the building, her eyes scanning the shadows. And there, just at the far end of the rooftop, she saw it, a figure. At first, it seemed like a person, hunched over, moving in a strange, unnatural way. Its head was turned towards her, and even in the dim light, she could see its eyes. They glowed with a faint, unnatural light, reflecting the dull glow of the street lamps below. But there was something wrong. Something not quite human about the shape of it. The figure stood frozen for a long moment, staring at her with those glowing eyes. It had a sickeningly wide grin, its mouth stretched unnaturally, the corners pulling back so far it almost looked like it had no skin. A face devoid of emotion, of life. Just the frozen, unnerving smile of something that was only pretending to be human. Tessa's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. She tried to move, to run back inside, but her legs felt heavy, like they were rooted to the ground. The figure on the roof didn't move. It just stood there, watching her, its grin stretching wider. She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but the sight of it kept her frozen. She could feel its eyes on her, could sense that it was waiting for her to make a move. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and instinctively, she stepped back toward the door, her hand fumbling for the handle. But as soon as she turned her back, the figure moved. Fast, too fast. It was suddenly right behind her, its shadow casting a dark, unnatural shape against the door as it lunged forward with a speed she couldn't comprehend. Tessa slammed the door shut just in time, but the force of its movement shook the entire building. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away from the door, her back pressed against the wall. She didn't dare look out the window. She didn't want to see those eyes again. She could hear it now, the scraping sound of claws on the roof, the unmistakable echo of footsteps too light, too fast to be human. The next morning, Tessa's neighbors found the door to her apartment wide open. The the lights flickering eerily in the darkness. But Tessa was gone, completely vanished, without a trace. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign that anything out of the ordinary had happened. The only thing out of place was the strange marks on the walls, like scratches made by something large, something with sharp claws. The residents of the building soon began to notice the strange scraping noises at night, always from the rooftops. As time passed, more people began to talk about the rooftop creeper, a creature or presence that seemed to have always existed, lurking in the high places of the city, hidden in plain sight. Some said it was an ancient being that had found refuge in the dark corners of the rooftops. Others claimed it was a new predator, something that had adapted to the urban jungle, moving with the night, feeding on fear. People began to avoid looking up. They started taking longer routes to avoid walking near rooftops. But no matter how hard they tried to ignore it, the rooftop creeper was always there, always watching, waiting. And once you noticed it, it was too late. No one knew how many it had claimed before, or how many more it would take. But the whispers were clear. It never comes down. It stays on the rooftops, lurking, waiting for the next person to see it. And once you do, once your eyes meet its glowing ones, you can never forget. Because the rooftop creeper always watches, always waits, and it never comes down. Thank you for joining us for today's chilling tales. If you enjoyed this stories, please make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to share the video. Your feedback means the world to us. If you want more spine-tingling stories, be sure to subscribe to Muzi Horror World so you never miss our next eerie tale. Stay curious, stay brave, and until next time, sleep tight if you can.